She had been awake for an hour before he stirred. That was the ritual. Isobel rising in the dark, wrapping herself in her morning robe, moving to the edge of the bed before the gray winter light could find her unprepared. 3 years of this. 3 years of sitting with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, while Ashbourne House breathed around her in the cold, composing herself into the shape she would need to hold when he opened his eyes. The window opposite threw a pale, colorless light across the floorboards. Outside, the elm trees stood stripped and still. She could hear faintly a cart moving somewhere on the far lane, the horse's breath clouding in the frost. Isobel sat and looked at her hands and thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its simplicity, that she had done this for the last time. Marcus turned toward her. His hand moved across the pillow in the half-conscious way it always did, reaching for the warmth she had left behind. And then his voice came. Low, still thick with sleep, the name falling from him as naturally as breathing. Annabelle. Isobel did not answer. She had answered to it 1,000 mornings. She had learned to respond with the right degree of softness, to turn toward him with the composed and gentle expression that the name seemed to require. She had become very good at it. What she had not anticipated, when she agreed to this marriage at 23, was that becoming good at something could itself become a kind of wound. She sat still, looking at her hands. Marcus was fully awake now. She could feel it without turning, the change in his breathing, the quality of the silence. Isobel, she said, without moving. Her voice was steady. She had not planned those words. She had planned others, more carefully arranged. But in the gray light of this particular morning, only the true thing would come. My name is Isobel, and today is the last day of pretending. He did not speak. She rose from the edge of the bed, smoothed her robe, and crossed the room to the door. At the doorframe she stopped, her hand resting on the wood, her back to him. I will be at Greybourne by evening, she said. I have left a note for William on the nursery table. She closed the door behind her. The latch caught with a small, definitive sound. Marcus sat up in the gray light. The name still hung in the air above the empty bed. There was no one left to receive it. The decision had not been made in that room. It had been made the night before, at the family dining table. At the moment a glass of wine met her hand, and she set it down. The Ashbourne dining room was long and candlelit. Its walls hung with portraits that had looked down on 100 such dinners without expression. Lady Ashbourne sat at the head. Marcus's mother, a woman whose elegance had calcified over the years into something that resembled authority and was not quite the same thing. The table held 7. Lady Ashbourne, Marcus, and Isobel. 2 of Marcus's cousins with their wives, and old Colonel Fairfax, who had known the family since before Marcus was born. The footman moved quietly. The soup had been excellent. And then, as reliably as the seasons, Lady Ashbourne had lifted her glass. To dear Annabelle's memory, she said, in the warm, carrying voice she reserved for toasts, and to dear Isobel, who carries her name with such grace. The whole table lifted their glasses. Colonel Fairfax, the cousins, their wives. Marcus, beside Isobel, lifted his. Isobel set hers down. She did not make a scene of it. She placed the glass on the white cloth with no more sound than if she had simply finished drinking. And then she turned her face to her husband and waited. She looked directly at him. Not at Lady Ashbourne, not at the table, at Marcus. She waited for him to register what she had done. She waited for him to set his own glass down. He did not. The toast was completed, Conversation resumed. The fish course arrived. Isobel ate her dinner with her hands in her lap between bites, because she did not trust them on the table, and she said nothing for the remainder of the meal. When the last dish was cleared, she excused herself, walked upstairs, and sat in the window of her dressing room for 2 hours while the house settled into sleep below her. She did not weep. She had done her weeping years ago, in another room, beside another bed, holding her sister's hand while Annabelle asked her to promise. Let him keep loving the woman he chose, Annabelle had said. She had been 26 and very weak and absolutely certain of what she was asking. Marcus needs someone who knew me. He needs to feel that she is still, that the house still. She had not finished the sentence. She had not needed to. Isobel had been 23. She had been at her sister's bedside for 6 weeks. She had said yes. She had said yes. She understood now, because it was the only thing she could give her dying sister that cost enough to feel like love. She had also said yes because she had sat across drawing rooms from Marcus Wycliffe for 2 years before Annabelle ever met him, watching him speak and laugh and argue and fall silent. And she had understood even then that she would not easily stop. The wedding had been quiet. 2 months after the funeral, in the small church at Ashbourne village, with only the families present and no flowers, because it seemed wrong to have flowers, Marcus had stood beside her at the altar with the expression of a man performing a duty he believed in. And she had stood beside him with the expression of a woman who had been told, clearly and by multiple people, what this marriage was for. Afterward, at the wedding breakfast, they had sat side by side at a table that felt too long, and at some point Marcus's hand had found hers beneath the white cloth. He had gripped it briefly, not gently, not tenderly, but with a pressure that said, I know this is strange. I know what we are doing. It had lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It was the only moment of that entire day that had felt like a marriage rather than a transaction. Isobel sat in her dressing room the night before she left and thought about that grip, about the 10 seconds, about 3 years of mornings. Then she went to bed, lay in the dark beside her sleeping husband, and made her decision. She arrived at Greybourne in the early evening, the carriage wheels loud on the frozen gravel drive. The house rose before her in the winter dusk. Old red brick and tall chimneys, ivy stripped back for the season, lights burning in the downstairs windows. She had grown up in this house. She knew which stairs creaked and where the drafts came in, and which armchair by the morning room fire had been her particular territory since she was 8 years old. She had not lived here in 3 years. She had not understood until she saw it again how much she had missed the particular quality of its silence. Her mother met her in the front parlor. Lady Wycliffe was a tall woman who had transmitted her height to both daughters and her composure to neither of them without effort, because composure in her case had never required effort. It was simply her natural register. She stood by the fireplace with her hands clasped and her expression arranged into something that was not quite disapproval and was not quite grief and was, in fact, both. The promise was sacred, Lady Wycliffe said, before Isobel had removed her traveling cloak. Your sister asked one thing of you. One thing. Good evening, Mother, Isobel said. I am not going to pretend this is an ordinary visit. I am not asking you to. Isobel handed her cloak to the waiting maid and turned to face her mother. I am asking you to let me go to my room. Isobel, I will not argue tonight. I am very tired, and I've been in a carriage for 5 hours. Whatever you need to say to me, it will keep until morning. Lady Wycliffe looked at her daughter for a long moment. the particular look that Isobel remembered from childhood, the one that catalogued and measured and did not always arrive at a kind verdict. Then she stepped aside. Isobel went upstairs. Her childhood room was exactly as she remembered it. The narrow bed with its blue coverlet, the window overlooking the kitchen garden, the bookshelf that still held the novels she had read at 16 and the sketchbooks she had filled at 18. She did not unpack. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room and felt something in her chest begin, very slowly, to loosen. She had no alarm to set in her mind, no ritual to prepare, no posture to arrange before the gray light found her. She lay down in her clothes and was asleep before the candle burned an inch. When she woke, the winter sun was fully up, the room bright and ordinary, and she lay still for a long moment, simply registering the unfamiliar fact that no one had called her name. Over the 3 days that followed, Isobel walked. The gardens at Greybourne were bare in February. The hedgerows stripped to their bones, the rose beds cut back to stubs, the gravel paths edged with frost that did not entirely melt even at midday. She walked them in the mornings with her hands in her coat pockets, following the routes she had walked as a girl. Down through the kitchen garden, along the yew hedge, out through the gate in the stone wall, and across the meadow to where the land began to rise toward the wood. She was not thinking about Marcus. She was trying, tentatively and with some difficulty, to think about herself. At 23, she had read widely and argued readily and written letters of considerable length and strong opinion to anyone who would receive them. She had had views about the enclosure of common land and the education of women and the particular moral failures of 3 specific novelists whose work she otherwise admired. She had a handwriting that was unmistakably her own. Angular, slightly too large, with a capital Y that leaned forward as if in a hurry. She had not written a letter of opinion in 3 years. She had not, she realized, formed an opinion she had spoken aloud in 3 years that was not first filtered through what Annabelle might have thought. On the 3rd morning, she walked to the chapel. It stood at the far end of the garden, small and stone, its door of weathered oak. Inside, she knew, was the grave marker. Plain limestone, Annabelle's name and dates. And below them the infant daughter who had not survived the birth. Isobel stood at the door with her hand on the iron ring of the latch and did not go in. She was not ready. She did not know exactly what she would say, and it seemed wrong to go in without knowing. She stood at the door for a long time, and then she walked back to the house. The message from Wycliffe Park arrived that afternoon. A boy on horseback, mud-splashed, with a folded note that had been written in haste. She could see it in the uneven pressure of the pen. William had a fever, high and climbing. The housekeeper at Wycliffe Park asked, with respectful urgency, whether her grace might come. Isobel read the note once. She folded it along its original crease and set it on the writing table. Then she went to the door of the parlor and called for the carriage. She rode through the night. Wycliffe Park stood dark against the pre-dawn sky when the carriage turned through its gates. Isobel was out of the door before the steps were fully down, her traveling bag left behind, moving through the entrance hall and up the stairs with the particular velocity of a woman who has sat still for 6 hours and spent every one of them imagining the worst. The nursery was lit and warm, a fire built high, the smell of camphor and warm flannel in the air. William lay in his small bed with his dark hair damp at the temples and his cheeks carrying the particular high color of a child's fever. Not the terrifying pallor, she told herself, not that. His breathing was audible, but even. The housekeeper stood at the far side of the room. Marcus stood at the window. He turned when she came in. Neither of them spoke. She went directly to the bed, pressed the back of her wrist to William's forehead, too warm, considerably too warm, and sat down in the chair beside him. When did it begin? she asked. Yesterday afternoon, Marcus said. He was well at luncheon. Has he kept any broth down? A little, an hour ago. They worked through the night in shifts, not by agreement, but by the natural rhythm of two people who know the same child. Isobel sat with William while Marcus rested, and Marcus took her place while she went to the kitchen for fresh water and cool cloths. They passed each other in the doorway. They spoke in the low, functional shorthand of the nursery. Temperature, broth, the cloth needs wringing. He stirred but did not fully wake. Nothing beyond that. The whole long, dark hours held only the child and the work of keeping him comfortable, and it was enough. Sometime before 4 in the morning, Isobel came back from the kitchen to find Marcus asleep in the chair. He had been awake for 30 hours. He was sitting with his chin dropped toward his chest, his coat still on, one hand fallen open on his knee. He looked, in the firelight, younger than she usually saw him. The particular defenselessness of sleep on a face that was otherwise very careful. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to the spare cot in the corner and took the folded quilt from its foot, carried it across the room, and settled it over his shoulders without waking him. Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder through the wool, not long, perhaps 3 seconds. And then she withdrew it and returned to the chair on the other side of William's bed. She had spent 3 years being the one who was tended to, managed, considered. The gesture was small. It was also the first time in 3 years she had moved to protect him rather than the reverse. And she registered the difference the way you register a door opening in a room you had stopped expecting doors in. William woke in the small hours. His eyes opened slowly, found her face, and stayed there with the particular gravity of a feverish child who has decided that whoever is in the room is the whole world. "Mama," he said, in a voice that was mostly breath. "I am here," Isobel said. "You are all right." William was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving across the room with the groggy, unfocused attention of someone between sleep and waking. Then he looked back at her. "Why does Papa call you by Auntie's name," he said, "when you are Mama?" The question arrived with the complete simplicity of a 3-year-old who has been turning something over in his mind for long enough that it has become a genuine puzzle requiring an answer. Isobel did not move. In the doorway, she had not heard him rise. Marcus stood with a pitcher of fresh water in his hand. His face was fully awake. He had heard every word. He did not come in. Isobel looked at William and smoothed the damp hair back from his forehead. "Go to sleep," she said. "We can talk about that when you are well." William considered this, decided it was acceptable, and closed his eyes. Within 2 minutes, his breathing had deepened. The fever broke by morning. The drawing room at Wycliffe Park was empty when Isobel found it before sunrise. She did not go there deliberately. She had simply walked downstairs after leaving William sleeping, and her feet had carried her through the hall and into the first quiet room. She sat on the sofa near the window and watched the sky above the garden begin its slow change from black to the dark blue that preceded dawn. She heard Marcus come in. He sat down beside her on the sofa without touching her, leaving a careful distance between them, and looked at the window. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Isobel said without turning her head, "Did you ever, even once, look at me in the morning and see me?" What followed was not an empty silence. It was the held breath of a man, measuring whether he is capable of the truth. "6 months ago," Marcus said at last. "I stopped seeing her in you 6 months ago." And I said nothing. Isobel turned her face away from him, toward the dark glass of the window. "I told myself I was protecting you," he said. "From the conversation, from what it would cost to have it. But that was not it." He stopped. I was protecting myself from having to tell my mother that the toast was a lie, from having to be the person who ended it. You let me sit at that table, Isobel said. Her voice was level. Every week, for 6 months, knowing. He said quietly, yes. She said nothing. The window showed her the faint outline of the garden emerging from the dark. After a long moment, Marcus reached across the space between them and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands. His, larger, the knuckle of his right thumb scarred from a riding accident years before she knew him. She did not pull away. She did not press back. She simply let him hold it. And they sat without speaking while the light came slowly up, and the first sounds of the household beginning its day reached them through the walls. The next morning, Isobel came down to find Marcus in the corridor with William's winter coat. Take him to Greybourne, Marcus said. He was not looking at her with any particular expression. He was simply saying the thing plainly, the way a man says a thing when he has spent the night deciding it. He needs you with him while he recovers. And you. He stopped. You were not finished. What you went there for, you were not finished. Marcus, I have no claim on you, he said. Not one I am willing to press. He handed her the coat and walked back toward the stairs. William recovered fully on the journey, as small children sometimes do. The crisis passing as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving him pink-cheeked and voluble by the time the carriage reached Sussex. At Greybourne, he ran ahead of her into the entrance hall and immediately demanded to know whether there were biscuits. There were biscuits. Lady Wycliffe, whatever her reservations about the visit's purpose, was constitutionally incapable of denying biscuits to her grandson. In the 2 weeks that followed, something began to happen that Isobel had not anticipated. William, in the way of young children who have no interest in the complexity of adult arrangements, simply called her Mama, not Isobel, not anything else. He called for her in the mornings and brought her things he found in the garden, a particularly interesting stone, a feather of uncertain origin, a stick he had decided was a sword, and expected her to be interested, which she was. She sat with him in the morning room while he drew pictures at the low table, and she read to him in the afternoons, and she noticed, with a grief that she could not have entirely explained, how much the child had been absorbing without anyone registering it. He had known something was wrong. He had simply lacked the vocabulary for it, until the fever loosened his careful small child restraint. She let herself be present in rooms without preparing first. She ate breakfast at whatever hour she woke, rather than at the arranged time. She began writing letters again, not to Ashbourne, but to a school friend in Edinburgh she had not corresponded with in 2 years. And the letters were long and specific, and contained her actual opinions about 3 separate subjects. The 2 documents arrived on the same afternoon. The first came by express messenger from Ashbourne House. It was written in Lady Ashbourne's hand, a small, precise hand that managed to convey authority even in the address. Isobel read it standing at the writing table in the parlor. A duchess living apart from her household is intolerable in the eyes of God and of society. It read, I have consulted the Bishop of Chichester, who concurs. I have written to your family solicitor and to the Ashbourne trustees. You will return before Easter, or consider yourself removed from all family correspondence and from the society invitations that your position as Duchess of Ashbourne has, until now, afforded you. This is not a request. It is the last courtesy I will extend. Isobel read it to the end. Then she carried it to the parlor fireplace and held it to the flame and watched it burn, feeding it in gradually so that every line was consumed before she let it go. She was still standing at the fireplace when her mother came in. Lady Wycliffe settled into the chair nearest the door, not the chair she usually chose, which told Isobel she had planned this approach and the seating was part of it. "I think," her mother said, "that you know what I'm going to say. You are going to tell me about Annabelle's promise," Isobel said. "I am going to tell you that a promise made to a dying woman is not a promise you can simply put aside because the arrangement has become inconvenient." "Inconvenient?" Isobel repeated the word carefully, as if examining it for damage. "I did not mean—" "I have spent 3 years," Isobel said, "answering to my dead sister's name in my own home. I have sat at a table every week while my husband's mother toasted Annabelle's memory and praised me for carrying her name with grace. And I have lifted my glass, and I have said nothing. Because Annabelle asked me to let Marcus keep loving the woman he chose. And I believed that was what I was doing." She paused. "I have been instructed, for 3 years, by the dead. I will not now be instructed by the living on the dead's behalf." Lady Wycliffe was silent. "She was my sister," Isobel said. "She was my sister, and I loved her, and I watched her die, and I agreed to what she asked because I was 23, and I could not bear to refuse her anything. But she is gone, Mother. She has been gone for 3 years, and I am still here." She stood, walked to the door, and went out into the garden. The garden, in early spring, held the particular quality of a place beginning to remember itself. Snowdrops in the beds nearest the house, the first green along the hedgerow, the gravel still winter damp. Isobel walked without direction, her hands loose at her sides, the cold air sharp enough to make her eyes water. She came around the bend in the path and found Marcus. His carriage was still at the gate. She could see the mud on the wheels from here. He had driven without stopping then. He was standing on the path with his hat in his hand, and he looked as though he had been standing there for some time without being certain whether to advance or retreat. Isobel did not speak. She did not stop walking. She walked past him. She heard him fall into step behind her. 3 paces back, not attempting to close the distance, simply following. She did not look back. She walked the length of the garden path, through the gate in the stone wall, along the familiar route she had walked every morning for 2 weeks, until the chapel stood before her at the far edge of the grounds, its oak door gray in the afternoon light. She put her hand on the iron ring. She opened the door. She went inside. She did not lock it behind her. The chapel was small and cold and smelled of stone and old wood and faintly of the beeswax candles that were lit on Sundays. The grave marker was set into the floor near the east wall. Plain limestone, exactly as she remembered. She stood before it and read the name she had been carrying for 3 years. Annabelle Mary Wycliffe, Duchess of Ashbourne. Beloved. She had been beautiful. She had been luminous in the way that certain people are luminous, not merely pretty, but lit from within, so that rooms rearranged themselves around her presence without anyone planning it. She had also been certain, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never had reason to doubt her own centrality, that what she was asking was a gift rather than a cost. Isobel stood at the marker and felt, for the first time without guilt, the full complicated weight of loving her sister and having been diminished by her at the same moment. She knew Marcus was outside. She had known it the entire hour she stood in the chapel. She could feel his presence through the oak door the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not by sight or sound, but by some shift in the quality of the air. She waited. She was not sure what she was waiting for. Then the door opened. Marcus came 3 paces into the chapel and stopped. He stood on the stone floor with his hat still in his hand and looked at her across the space between them. He did not look away. "Isobel," he said, once. Plainly, her own name, in his voice, in the cold air of the chapel. It was the first time he had spoken it to her. Not Isobel as a correction, not Isobel as a formal address, but Isobel the way you say a name when you mean the person entirely. She waited. "I have to tell you something," he said. "I have been trying to find the right way to say it for 6 months. There is no right way, so I am going to say it plainly." He moved nothing except his mouth. "6 months ago, I stopped feeling Annabelle in you. I cannot tell you the exact morning. There was no single moment. It simply happened, the way a season changes. And one day I looked at you across the breakfast table, and what I saw was you. Not her. Not her memory wearing your face. You." He stopped. And I said nothing. Isobel held herself very still. "Every week after that," Marcus continued, "my mother raised her glass, and I raised mine beside you, and the toast was a lie. Not a grief I was managing, not a kindness to my mother. A lie I performed in front of my wife every week, because ending it would have required me to act, and I did not." He looked at the hat in his hands. "I have been telling myself for 3 years that I was honoring a promise. For the last 6 months, I have been doing something considerably less honorable than that." Isobel said nothing. "I am not asking your forgiveness," Marcus said. "I don't know that it's mine to ask for. But I need to ask you one thing." He looked up. "The woman you have been in that house, in that marriage, at that table, was any part of it yours? Did any part of you stay because you chose to?" The question landed in the cold air of the chapel and stayed there. Isobel was quiet for a moment. Not because she did not know the answer, because she had never said it aloud, and saying it aloud would change the shape of the last 3 years in a way that could not be undone. "I loved you," she said at last, "before Annabelle ever met you. I used to watch you across drawing rooms and think. I was very careful never to act on it, because she was my sister, and she loved you, and I was not the kind of woman who acts on things of that nature. But I watched you, and when she asked me to promise, the promise was, it was the easiest way to have what I had already wanted. That is the part I have never been able to say to anyone." She stopped. The hardest thing about the last 3 years was not being called by the wrong name. The hardest thing was knowing that I had agreed to it, that I had walked into that chapel 2 months after her funeral and married you, and told myself it was entirely for her sake, and it was not entirely for her sake. And I have been paying for that ever since. Marcus had not moved. "The name," Isobel said. "That is the part I cannot carry any longer. Not the marriage, not the house, not even your mother's table. The name." She crossed the chapel floor. She raised her hands and took his face between them, her cold hands on his jaw. And she looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him across the dining table the night she set down her glass, except this time she was close enough to see the specific gray of his eyes. "Isobel," she said. Her own name, spoken by herself, in the room where her sister was buried. "Say it back," Marcus said quietly. "Isobel." She kissed him, slowly, deliberately, with both hands still holding his face, not a gesture of forgiveness and not a concession, and not the quiet transaction of 2 people performing a marriage. The first kiss of 3 years that had belonged entirely to her. They walked back from the chapel to the house together, side by side on the gravel path, the spring evening going golden around them. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying immediately, and they were both, in their different ways, people who understood the value of not filling a silence that did not need filling. Lady Wycliffe was waiting at the front door. She stood at the top of the steps with her hands clasped, the same posture she had held in the parlor 2 weeks ago. and she looked at them coming up the path with an expression that was trying, with limited success, to conceal how carefully she had been watching the garden. Marcus stopped at the base of the steps. He looked up at Lady Wycliffe with the particular directness of a man who has decided, sometime in the last hour, that he is done managing his words. "Lady Wycliffe," he said, "your daughter will choose her own path from this point. I genuinely hope, for your blessing. But I am not going to ask her to earn it." Lady Wycliffe looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Isobel. Isobel met her mother's eyes and waited. Something moved across Lady Wycliffe's face. Not quite acceptance, not quite grief, but something in the country between them. She stepped aside from the door. They left for Ashbourne that afternoon. William was carried out half asleep and set between them on the carriage seat, his head drooping against Isobel's arm before the wheels had cleared the gate. The carriage moved out through the Sussex lanes in the last of the evening light, and Isobel watched the hedgerows pass and felt the weight of the sleeping child against her side and said nothing. Because there was nothing that needed saying, and because silence, for the first time in 3 years, felt like her own. 6 weeks later, the dining room at Ashbourne House held its usual Thursday dinner. The candles were lit. The table was set with the Ashbourne silver, which was very fine and very old. Lady Ashbourne sat at the head, in the chair that had been hers for 40 years, in the black gown she had worn to formal dinners since her husband's death. The cousins were present. Colonel Fairfax, a young clergyman who had recently been given the local living and was still navigating the particular social topography of the Ashbourne table. Marcus and Isobel sat together on the left side, with William already put to bed upstairs. The soup was cleared. The fish arrived. The conversation moved in its usual channels. And then Lady Ashbourne lifted her glass. "To dear Annabelle's memory," she said in the warm, caring voice. "And to dear Isobel, who—" Marcus set his glass down, not loudly, not dramatically. He simply placed it on the white cloth with a quiet, final sound, and the small click of crystal on linen carried in the stillness the way small sounds do when a room suddenly decides to listen. "Mother," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely without hesitation. "We will toast my late wife by her own name, and we will toast my wife by hers." Lady Ashbourne's hand remained raised, the glass held before her, the sentence incomplete in the air. The room was still. Colonel Fairfax looked at his plate. The cousins looked at each other. The young clergyman looked at no one, which was the wisest thing he had done since arriving. Lady Ashbourne looked at her son. Marcus did not look away. The moment held. Then, very slowly, Lady Ashbourne lowered her glass to the table. She did not set it down with any particular feeling. She simply placed it before her and looked at the table and said nothing. No one else lifted their glass. The toast was not completed. The conversation did not resume for nearly a full minute, and when it did, it was the young clergyman who began it, saying something about the weather, which was brave of him. The rest of the dinner passed in the ordinary way. The candles burned down. The port was served. The company dispersed. Isobel sat at the table where the ritual had lived for 3 years and felt, in the place where the ritual had been, a stillness that was entirely different from the stillness of the last 3 years. Not the stillness of something suppressed, the stillness of something finished. Summer came to Ashbourne House the way it always did. Slowly, then all at once, the elms filling out along the drive, the kitchen garden going riotous, the drawing-room windows thrown open for the first time since October. The gray light of winter was entirely gone. The house held a different quality of air, warmer, looser, carrying the smell of cut grass and the distant sound of William in the garden with the dog that Marcus had acquired for him in May, a small terrier of uncertain breed and absolute confidence. The bedroom was changed by the summer, the heavy curtains that had held the gray winter light at bay, that Isobel had always kept drawn until she was composed and ready, were thrown open now, both of them, so that the morning sun came in fully and without apology and lay in wide bars across the floorboards and the foot of the bed. Isobel was awake. She had not risen before him. She had not moved to the edge of the bed to arrange herself into the shape the morning required. She lay in the summer light with her eyes open, listening to the garden and the terrier and William's voice carrying up from below. And she was simply present in the room. Marcus stirred beside her. She felt him come awake, the same change in breathing she had always known. Except now she was still in the bed beside him when it happened, rather than sitting at its edge waiting for it. He turned toward her. "Isobel," he said, into the bright room. She turned toward him and answered. It was a small thing. It was an entirely ordinary exchange between two people waking in the same bed on a summer morning. It was also the first time in 3 years that her name had been spoken into the morning air of that room, and received by the person it belonged to. Across the room, on the mantelpiece between the two candlesticks, a small oval miniature stood in an open place. Annabelle's face, painted at 24, the year before she died. The luminous quality captured imperfectly but recognizably in the artist's rendering of her expression. Not tucked away in a drawer, not placed on an altar to be toasted. Simply there, on the mantelpiece, in the ordinary company of the room's other objects. Present in the way that the dead are present when you have made your peace with them. Not as an instruction, not as a reproach, simply as a face you loved. A knock at the door, and the maid entered with a tray. 2 cups of tea, steam rising in the morning air, a small plate of toast. She set it on the table near the window and withdrew without ceremony. 2 cups, 1 tray. Down the hall, William's voice lifted. "Mama." Not a cry of distress. The particular bright imperative of a 3-year-old who has decided the morning has begun and wishes everyone else to agree with this assessment immediately. Isobel rose from the bed. She found her robe, wrapped it around herself, crossed the room toward the door. At the doorframe she paused, her hand resting on the wood, the summer light full on her back. And then she walked through toward her son. Marcus lay in the bright room and watched her go. Not the careful, composed departure of a woman who had spent 3 years leaving before she could be seen. A woman crossing a room she lived in, moving toward a child who was calling her by her right name. The gray light of the opening scene was gone. The curtains were open. The morning was entirely ordinary and entirely hers.